Awesome. I want to welcome everyone to the 2021 conference. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our sponsors, our speakers, our planning committee, you participants, attendees, everyone. Thanks for coming. I know that a few months ago we were wishing that we would have planned an in-person meeting, and we were kind of, I wouldn't say regretting, but we were questioning our choice of going virtual. But with everything that's been going on with the pandemic, with the new surge that came up a couple of months ago, we're really glad that we did decide to stay virtual, and we're glad that you all are here. So thank you very much for that. As I said, thank you to our sponsors. We had a lot that we're very appreciative of, as you can see here on the slide. So thank you very much for being here. And I know that a lot of you are considered essential workers, and you probably didn't get an opportunity to stay at home and binge watch all the different things that people were talking about binge watching, because we all had to be working our normal jobs. So thank you for that. So I want to introduce Megan Warfield, and hopefully I said that correctly. She is our Northwest president, chapter president, and also the chair for this planning committee. So welcome, Megan. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Victoria. And on behalf of the entire planning committee, we're so happy to welcome everyone for joining us online this morning. We wish you could be here in the Pacific Northwest with us. So we actually created a video introducing each of the conference planning members, and the video features scenes from the Pacific Northwest, both activities we love to do and the beautiful places that we wish we could share in person. Check out the video on the planning committee tab. It's only 2 minutes long. But no matter what time zone you're joining us from, we have a really packed agenda today.
Awesome. So I know that people really miss the in-person camaraderie, but how can we all stay connected through this app, not the app, but the platform, Socio platform?
So Socio offers several ways for people to actually make connections with other conference participants and speakers. If you go to the attendees tab in Socio and you connect to people individually, they then become your connection, and you can do chats with them. You could set up a video chat, you can send them emails. And then for speakers, you go to the speakers tab, and it also offers an email. So if you want to follow up with a speaker after their presentation or have more questions that we run out of time, you can contact speakers that way.
Awesome, thank you. Also, one of the things that we love about NAMA is getting together and having fun. So I know that we have a fun committee. How is the fun committee planned to make sure that we have fun here?
We tried to find all kinds of ways to have fun, even though we are online. For example, this morning, for those who got up super early on the West Coast, there was a yoga session that I tuned in for about 10 minutes to get some stretches in. And later this afternoon, we have a social hour with a trivia contest. And for those with a more competitive spirit, we have a pet photo contest. We have a virtual 5K event, because getting up and moving, stepping away from our computers is really important this time of year. So just check out the announcements page and you can find out information about some of these fun activities. There's also a virtual activity tab within Socio, or just look at the social wall and see some of the really cute pet photos and even a baby photo in there too. And for all these activities, we're offering prizes. So if that's not incentive to join some of them, I don't know what is. So again, check the announcements page in the social wall and find a way to have fun with your NAMA peers.
Awesome. And speaking of that baby in the social wall, Shelly Fuller had her little boy, and someone has posted a picture. So Shelly, if you're out there, congratulations. Give Zoe a big hug for us, and her little brother Wyatt. So the next thing that people love to do at the conference, and actually a little bit before the conference normally, is that we go on tours. So how are we making sure that people are able to show off their facilities?
Yes, I really missed the tour aspect of the conference, but we recruited 5 people from around the country to video short videos of their facilities, kind of walkthroughs of their facilities and the services they offer to their communities. So those tour videos are available on the HHW Tours tab. And more importantly, tomorrow, late morning, my time, I'm in the Pacific Northwest, we have a session, an HHW Tour Q&A session, where those facility operators will be there in the session to answer any of your questions. So just as if you were on the tour and you had a question, those folks are going to be there. So watch those videos before that session tomorrow.
Awesome. Megan, do you know how many conferences you've been to?
Oh my, I'd want to say a dozen.
Awesome. So you know that there's lots of different things that happen, but for this conference, what are you looking forward to most?
Well, in addition to all the fun stuff we have planned, I'm excited to hear from our keynote speakers. Both Carolyn and Monona have spoken at NAMA conferences in the past, and I'm curious to see and hear updates from them. And I'm also interested in the environmental justice session that's coming up. And this year's award ceremony is going to be like none other. So everybody, please join that and honor your NAMA peers.
And I believe the award ceremony is at 1 Central today. So be sure to join that. It does look like it's going to be a lot of fun. Do you happen to have any teasers about a session or sessions?
Well, I'm a sucker for a good dog story. And one of our pre-recorded sessions is about a dog that is PCB sniffing. This dog is used to detect PCBs in buildings. So I'm really interested in that and some of our other pre-recorded sessions. And again, I mentioned we have the equity and social justice panel with a hazardous waste lens. So those are just 2 of the ones that I'm really looking forward to.
Okay, cool. So do you have any tips for people that are using the Socio platform, both on the web and the app on their phones?
Yeah, I really don't want people to miss things. Sometimes on Socio, everything doesn't show up on one screen. So if you're using the web-based version on your computer or laptop, make sure you scroll down to make sure you see all those tabs on the left-hand side. And if you happen to be on your phone, you're going to have to swipe left to see all the various tabs.
Awesome.
And just a reminder, all these sessions are going to be recorded. So if you do have to step away or missed one of them, the recordings will be sent out later.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And thank you to the planning committee for your great hard work and the great job that you've done to get this planned. So again, I want to thank all of our sponsors, and I wanted to introduce to you Jim Quinn, who is going to introduce our keynote speakers.
Good morning. Starting my video here. Okay, good morning. Thank you, Victoria and Megan, for getting rolling here. And as Megan mentioned, we're bringing back 2 speakers that we had with us at previous conferences. We obviously enjoyed their presentations and thought we'd bring them back. They're going to be talking, the unifying theme between their talks is precaution. Pretty excited to hear what each of them has to say about that topic. We're going to start with Monona Rossell. Is Monona queued up here? Okay, great. And we had her at our Seattle chapter conference in 2015, and she kind of rocked the house. So we decided to bring her back for this conference. Monona starts her bio saying that she was born into a vaudeville family and began working as a professional entertainer at age 3 and continues to perform occasionally to this day. As far as education, her BS was in chemistry with a minor in math, and then she went on to do graduate work in art and music. And she started as a research chemist and moved into industrial hygiene. And then starting in 1983, specialized in safety and regulatory training in art and theater world. And she's done training and lectures across the country and across the world in that field, consulted on the planning of over 80 buildings, specifying the ventilation and safety features, and that won her 3 architectural awards. She's also written 9 books, a couple of which are used as college texts. So with that introduction, I'm gonna turn it over to Monona. You ready to roll, Monona?
Yep, gonna get my PowerPoint up here. Show. Can we see that?
Yep.
Okay, we're ready to go. So, just a quick thank you for inviting me. Maybe 2015 wasn't too bad, or maybe you're just giving me a chance to get it right this time. The precautionary principle is the theme for both of the keynotes, and I wondered if you would have hired me to do that if you'd have known all about that early life you mentioned, because I did start out in vaudeville, and I did have my union card at age 3, and I saw children killed and harmed. And I myself had many injuries, many adults did. This was my father and his sister with our original name. And of course, that doesn't work for business. So my aunt became Olivia Monona, sang opera for 25 years with the Met. She started out in vaudeville, but very quickly went to serious music. My father's name went through a number of changes. He did traditional magic and he did escape. There he is upside down, hanging by his feet, 2 stories in the air. We took chances. He was also, this is a trick that won him the Houdini award 3 times in a row. In case you think that's all kumbaya stuff, we didn't get along. We worked together, but my family and I were not very close. So I was a magician's assistant, a stooge, a shill, an acrobat, a record mime, and a singer, but my main vaudeville job was the second act slot. And that meant you have to get the audience to sympathize, identify, and support, maybe get them to sing along. And important to be the same nationality as the audience, which meant I was introduced with different names. I had no idea what my legal name was. So when the court said I had to go to school and they enrolled me in grade school, the first question they asked me was my name, and I got it wrong. I mean, nowhere near right. And that was a harbinger of things to come. When they asked me what you did on vacation, I took the 5th, because no one in my school would ever know what my sister and I did. Show people back then were considered trash. And you would never, I mean, you'd pay to go and see show people, but you wouldn't invite them to your home. I mean, it was just the way it was. In high school, no one knew either. And I went to a university high school, which was good because we had practice teachers, and if they had to pull me out for something, I could catch up pretty easily with all of the help. And that meant I also started working on the UW campus in my part-time jobs. And I sang their opera and all that stuff. A few weeks after graduation, I was emancipated. I was thrown out of the house is what I was. And I managed to forge my parents' signature on an application for the university and put myself through school. One of the highlights of my education was meeting Aaron J. Ide and Odell Taliaferro. They combined chemistry with showbiz, which of course appealed greatly to me. And Dr. Ide later hired me as a teaching assistant. And Odell and I shared NAACP membership, political views, and a practice room in the music annex. He was a great pianist. So the university was a series of failures. I finished pre-med in 1957, not a good year for women. And I expected to be welcomed into medical school. They had just passed a law saying they had to take 10% women. And we were given an orientation that said, we don't want any of you here. We're only forced to take 10%. And I didn't know about discrimination against women because as long as men can't sing soprano, I didn't see it in my working life. So I was really smacked by this. I just gave them the sign of the finger and left. So I got a degree in chemistry with a minor in math, and I was expecting to be welcomed into the PhD program. Wrong again. Instead, they told me I could take a job as a research assistant in chemistry. And so I did the lab work for 3 PhDs that men got. So I don't have a lot of respect for, PhD people, because I think I could have successfully defended all 3 of those PhDs. But there's no initials after my name. And it's one of the reasons I probably signed my name as Monona and nothing else, because I don't think that the degrees I have in any way tell you what I know. I did my graduate seminars in art on chemical safety because I thought the artists will want to know about the hazards of their materials. Wrong again. They walked out. They didn't think that would, they thought that kind of knowledge would interfere with their creativity, is the way they put it. And I got 2 graduate degrees in art taught at the faculty level and all. I thought I could teach somewhere, and I was wrong on that as well. These are my credentials. I had far more credentials than any of the boys, and I use that word knowingly, that I graduated with. But I was not even allowed to use the placement bureau at the University of Wisconsin. I filled the application out, and all it needs is your major professor to sign. And he refused and clearly said, not only to me, but to another person, that women don't get those jobs. So I had to make pottery, do summer stock, travel, so on. And I started consulting on safety already. Now, I had no business consulting on it, but nobody else did it at all. And I certainly knew more than most. So when people had problems with their ventilation or with clay and glaze chemicals or their kiln building or whatever, I started consulting. In 1968, I was working in a show with some pals, and we just decided we'd had it and got into cars and went to New York. We didn't even know where we were going to stay. But immediately, I got an off-Broadway lead. I started singing with Tran Rhodes, who was a wonderful producer and director. And I can't tell you what my day job was, but trust me, it was legal and very interesting. And so I was doing all of these jobs, working, and one of them was doing songs lyrics by E.Y. Yip Harburg. And I got to know him quite well. And we were actually doing some things together when he was killed in a car accident. So now I've got to get you from vaudeville to ventilation. And that started really officially when I met 2 other people in New York in '77 that were interested in art safety. And we formed the Center for Occupational Hazards that later became known as the Center for Safety in the Arts. And I began working in industrial hygiene. There is a way to become an industrial hygienist that was common at the time, where your work is reviewed after 5 years, and you can, by 2 members of the AIHA. So I did my first ventilation planning in '83. By '84, I was a full member of the American Industrial Hygiene, based on the reports on facilities that I had written over those last 5 years. And by '84, I also got my first ventilation award because I had a unique approach to this. And also I learned that if you teach ventilation, as soon as you learn something, if you include it in your lectures and teaching, that's the best way to learn. I left the nonprofit in '87, set up my own. we're the most stable nonprofit you've never heard of, because we don't solicit donations and we get them. We don't hold fundraisers or apply for grants, but we get grants. We don't do mailings. It's just the most stable nonprofit you've never heard of. And through ACTS, I started combining building planning with my theater career, because all this time, of course, I was performing also. And I never told anyone in the industrial hygiene community about this, because, again, I was having enough trouble getting respect as a woman in a science field without them coming to some after hours gay club and seeing me with my knockers shoved up under my chin. So it was a really important thing to just kind of keep those two lives somewhat separate. In 1995, I became the safety officer for the United Scenic Artists, and I'm still that today. In 2017, I became the consultant for SAG-AFTRA, and I'm also the consultant for Local 802, Musicians Union, and some others. I was one of the COVID experts on the Safe Way Forward plan for the film industry, because we opened in June of 2020, and we have been open ever since. And I set the standards for ventilation for them. And entertainment is the very best place for ventilation designers. Why? Because we deal with tiny 20-foot makeup trailers, and we deal with massive arenas and armories and everything in between. The buildings are from brand new to historic sites. They're well maintained to abandoned. We've seen every known hazard: lead paint, asbestos, structural hazards, rats, old chemical storage, PCBs, mercury spills. We've seen it all. And we have to ventilate what for? For pyrotechnics, bullets, explosions, fires, car crashes indoors, yes. Welding, wood shops, spray paints, hair and makeup rooms, you name it. We've got to come up with a way to make it happen. Our air quality, we can be filled with theatrical fog, flammable dusts, fake snow, Lord knows what else. And our workers can include the elderly, infirm, and children commonly. So it's a wide range of things you have to learn in this area. I've now consulted on the planning of over 80 art and performing arts buildings all over the world, actually. And I've gotten some awards, as Jim mentioned. This is the most important building in terms of awards. It got the AIA Code Award. And we used the ventilation needs in stacks, and we made that a design element. It's a beautiful building, but it's in Wyoming. I love Wyoming. Nobody goes to Wyoming, but so you can see it there. I did the ventilation for this UMass Studio Arts building also. And that's where I usually teach my 40-hour course, because then we can take field trips in the building to see good ventilation systems. The last 2 years, I'm doing it on Zoom. And there is a module in that course on waste management that should be of interest. You know, we talk about how to get and interpret a copy of the school's wastewater permit and interpret that data and consider the local POTW's discharge limits, calculate how much water a single 1 ounce tube of cadmium sulfide pigment in an artist's paint tube can contaminate water to the limit. We talk about setting up satellite accumulation areas and methods of waste reductions in the various crafts. So it's an interesting course. So part 2 of this presentation is on the precautionary principle in industrial hygiene. And in occupational health, the definition is that the precautionary principle is an approach for protecting workers in circumstances of scientific uncertainty, reflecting the need to take prudent action in the face of potentially serious hazards without having to await complete scientific proof that a course of action is necessary. You could sum that up by saying we err on the side of caution. But there are 4 times in my work where the precautionary principle has been absolutely pivotal. And the first one is in the teaching of hazard communication and how I introduced this concept. We all know that hazard communication requires training of workers on the chemicals. And unfortunately, most of my students walk into class thinking manufacturers wouldn't sell products that were not tested for toxicity. And of course, you all know that nothing could be further from the truth. The number of possible chemicals is almost infinite. There's over 200 million chemicals that have been registered by the Chemical Abstract Service. You can purchase any of 32 million uniquely different chemicals from catalogs at this moment, but there's only about 1,300 that have been studied enough to even know whether they are carcinogens or not. So most chemicals have no chronic toxicity data, and many have no acute either. And I explained that new chemicals have always been assumed to be safe. And if we look at radium, oh my gosh, it glows. It must be wonderful. We all know about the radium dial painters, but it was in dietary supplements and paints and cosmetics and laxatives. It's just in everything back then. And that's true of practically all of the new chemicals. There's nothing stopping them from going into products. Radium is just a long time ago, but what is introduced today, and this is the statement on the National Toxicology Program's website. Each year, an estimated 2,000 new chemicals are introduced for use in everyday items such as foods, personal care products, prescription drugs, household cleaners, lawn care products. We do not know the effects of many of these chemicals on our health, yet we may be exposed to them while manufacturing, distributing, using, and disposing of them, or when they become pollutants in our air, water, or soil. Relatively few chemicals are thought to pose a significant risk to human health, but no one knows. Does that sound right to anyone? It just is insanity on the face of it. And industry's research and development plan for all of this time has been the same. Discover a new chemical, find a market for it. There's nothing in between. And if you get sick, other agencies will test the chemical, usually at taxpayers' or activists' expense. So why would they test? If testing indicates the product is toxic, then they will fund research to confuse the data. They'll deny it's toxic and continue to sell it. If it's finally banned, then they will substitute an untested chemical for the banned one, sell the new product as chemical X-free, and you can start step one over again. That's been their plan all along with things like bisphenol A, and we get products that are so bisphenol A free, but they may contain bisphenol A, F, bisphenol S, bisphenol C, and I put these chemical formulas up for my students, even when they're not chemists, because it should be pretty clear there are similarities between these. And we really should be testing these chemicals. Another really good example is phenolphthalein. And everybody has used phenolphthalein in high school. It's an indicator dye for acid base. And it was discovered way back in 1858. That's 100 years before the Food and Drug Act. When the Food and Drug Act came into being, all chemicals that were being used prior to 1958 were immediately given generally recognized as safe status. And this was a common laxative from 1860s to the 1992, when it was finally tested and found to be one of the most potent carcinogens ever tested. So what about X-Lax? I was watching the commercials, and they said they'd replaced their previous chemical with natural senna because it's gentler. They never mentioned that phenolphthalein was found to be a carcinogen and banned. And what about the senna? All the people who take it really don't check. This is a Sigma-Aldrich data sheet. We don't know anything about this chemical. And there are other laxative chemicals like Dantron that are banned as carcinogens. But we know nothing about this one, and yet people will take it. Even our chimp ancestors were smart enough to realize that most plants are toxic or outright, bad for you. Here's another example. Whole aloe vera and golden seal root are listed as group 2B carcinogens by IARC. So, I mean, this has been going on a long time. Quaternary amines, again, they're in everything. And during the pandemic, they were the base for many of the EPA N-list sanitizers and disinfectors. And they're in everything, even toothpaste, mouthwash. They just put them everywhere. And they were, of course, untested, as all of these chemicals are. And they were accidentally tested because mice and rats, which are bred for testing, their genetic history goes back hundreds of generations. And yet all of a sudden, the lab studies using these mice found that the offspring had neural tube defects. And when they traced the reason back, they found out what they had been doing is cleaning the cages with a quaternary amine product. So this just tells us we really don't know what we're living in now. And the law protects this industry practice. There's no downside to selling products with unproven effects. We get after the asbestos and cigarette makers because they distributed after they knew. That's the real kicker there. But you only have to label a product as hazardous if those hazards are known and proven. And in the absence of proof, US manufacturers can label untested chemicals as non-toxic, and they do. So this is where I get to the precautionary principle for my students, because the EU is not falling apart, and its laws, similar laws, are all based on the precautionary principle. In the absence of data, you can't assume a chemical is safe, and their laws function. So they can't use the word non-toxic on untested chemicals and so on. Okay, the second instance in which the precautionary principle is vital to the way I deal with industrial hygiene is in respiratory precautions. And I hope we all know that obviously this virus is airborne, and the most dangerous part of the aerosol is in the 0.1 to 5 micron in diameter range. And this stuff floats on the air like smoke, won't settle for hours, goes where currents take them. And this is an anti-maskers video, which I used to show, which we all knew, that vape aerosol, which is about the size as the virus, a little bigger, goes right through all the barrier masks. None of these things will even slow it down. Well, they do slow it down, but they don't stop it. And masks with exhalation valves are also covered, and that's consistent with the Fluid Physics Journal tests of valved N95s. So why wear the masks? Actually, the video tells you some good reasons, because they do capture the large droplets, and that does help. And they slow down the exhaled breath, which means the exhaled breath does not go as far from the wearer, which makes the 6-foot rule more useful. The masks remind people to be careful. The photos demonstrate clearly for my ventilation colleagues that the aerosol does not go up and get caught in the body heat envelope, which all of the ASHRAE people are talking about. And it goes in every which direction. There is no reason to go ceiling to floor to ceiling, when we think that ceiling to floor would be a much better direction. It visually supports the reasons not to use exhalation valves. And in the last part of the video, it makes it clear that the only really good way to protect yourself is to wear a real respirator like an N95. And most of us now recommend N95s. Many of our workers are already in a respiratory protection program, and we say, well, go back to it. Put the damn thing on whenever there's a potential for being exposed to somebody. And workers not in a formal program should have access to them under the voluntary use in our estimation. And that just obligates the employer to provide a copy of Appendix D of the OSHA program and explain some of the problem. And if you have a clever person who can make sure they get a mask that fits and put it on right, they may have actually really good protection. This is an ACGIH document, which looks at how much time you'd have to be around someone who was infected in order to catch the disease. Now, you really shouldn't consider any of those numbers as reliable because you could get it in a lot shorter time, but they have looked at a typical situation. The important thing is to look at the difference. If both people are wearing a cloth mask, the time goes from 27 minutes to a badly fitted 10% leakage mask to 24 hours. That's significant because the difference between these numbers is significant. The numbers themselves are pretty shaky because there's just too many variables in that equation. But you can rely on the relative difference between the amounts of time. And there are plenty of N95s on the market now. Don't buy KN95s. Many are counterfeit. They've lost NIOSH certification, and support those manufacturers who busted their humps to get enough N95s out there for us. OSHA has a voluntary program for workers who are not properly tested, and that's what we say they should be. And this makes it possible, legal, and consistent with the precautionary principle. Third precautionary principle guide was in designing ventilation for chemical use, which is what I've been doing all along, pre-pandemic. And we design to the TLV plus a safety factor. The TLVs, I'm sure you all know, are set at levels expected not to cause harm to most healthy adults, and usually males because the study were males. So we have safety factors in there for our populations and for the conditions and so on. And we can then calculate the requirement for cubic feet per minute of ventilation. And here's some examples of TLVs. The big numbers are less toxic. Get down here and it's highly toxic. The smaller the number, the less is allowed in the air for that worker, the more toxic the substance is by inhalation. Now, this is the formula that we use to calculate cubic feet per minute, but I'm not going to hold you to that on the test. I just want you to note that the TLV is in the denominator, which means the lower that number, the higher the amount of CFM. Pretty obvious. And so when I'm doing a job, let's say for a painting studio, and I want them to use Gamsol and stay away from the less toxic turpentine, I can literally do the calculations and show them that we can do 200 CFM per person for the Gamsol, but we really can't do 1,300 for the turpentine. And look at what a room full of 10 painters would do. We'd have to have a wind tunnel. And what about this guy? Now, before you think I'm picking on him, I don't think I could have got through the pandemic without him telling me that the sky is happy and the trees are happy and the rocks are happy. But this guy is doing himself in. This canvas is covered with a liquid paint, and its solvent is mineral spirits. The palette is off-gassing. Here's a container of the solvent, and he dips his brush in and slams it on the diesel leg. I've watched him for months, and I'm estimating that somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 CFM are going to be needed just for this guy in the studio to do what he's doing. Okay, but now how do we vent for ingredients that don't have TLVs? For those unknown ingredients that we were talking about. This happens to be an Epson printer. Now, you may think an Epson printer is a small thing. We have Epson printers that can print backdrops, huge, 48-inch plus. And so please understand that we go through a lot of printer ink in certain areas of my business. And here we don't know what the TLVs are, but there's every reason to think that this 5 part per million TLV, which is quite low, these would probably be pretty close to that, but we don't know. And in case you think I'm picking on Epson, it's the same with 3M and the others. Most of the products in those inks, we know nothing about, absolutely nothing. So, and here's another situation. The 3D printer is putting out nanoparticles of plastic, all of the additives, the gases and vapors. We don't know what that's doing to people, but we know that some of the things are toxic. And we just expose even children to these 3D printers. That's insane. So using the precautionary principle, we believe in enclosing these things and venting them to the outside, and to better be safe than to make the workplace an experiment in exposure to many untested and chemicals. The fourth precautionary principle instance is in this pandemic. And it starts with who do you believe? Because if you'd have waited 14 months for the CDC to finally realize that it was an aerosol, we'd have lost more than a year's work. So we all knew right from the beginning that this was aerosol. And the question is, do you take ASHRAE's advice? That's what most people are doing. Well, I'm sorry. Look at their name. The American Society of Heating, Refrigerating, and Air Conditioning Engineers. Do you see anything there about toxic substances or industrial? They are comfort ventilation people. And they deal with cleaning up air that's coming into the building, and that's about it. The recirculating ventilation wouldn't capture this aerosol the way their standards are set up. And they've made noises about modifying the systems. But the real experts here is the ACGIH, and how you deal with control of airborne substances that are created in the building. So when these came out August 4th, and their effective controls are listed as 6 to 12 air changes per hour, that's all I needed to see. ASHRAE also mentioned 6 air changes for healthcare patient rooms. But, you know, they said nothing about schools or businesses. And I thought, well, what are we, chopped liver? So I set a 6 air change per hour standard for our units. And they recommend a MERV 13, but that only captures 50% of the aerosol. So we would like to see a MERV 17, but we'll take 13 and low and 15. But then you've got to add some outdoor air to dilute the filtered air. And the CDC and ASHRAE kept recommending maximized ventilation rates. Well, yeah, from what to what? You can't negotiate maximize. So we set minimum standards, and there they are. You are welcome to use them, because I'm telling you, we have over a year's experience. And with other precautions and masks and common sense, they have kept us open with very few incidents of transmission. So we are really happy to have had the work. Our standards are better than others, and it has allowed us to stay open. The codes have been no help. There are 11 experts on the Safe Way Forward plan. This came out in June, and every 3 months we renegotiate our work plans, and all of the unions work together, and we fought for our standards, even though they're not recognized by government agencies, but they are consistent with the precautionary principle. So, and since I plan to sing again, I ask you to catch my act after the pandemic, be in some club here in New York. And what do I expect you to take away from this? All right, let's go through what you need to have learned. I hope you learned that vaudeville never effing died. I hope you never stop singing or whatever you do for love. I hope you love your job so much that it isn't work. I hope you have found a community, employer, or union that enables you to follow your conscience and the precautionary principle. And I hope you never look at a TV show, movie, or an aging saloon singer in quite the same way. Here's a shameless plug for coming to my ventilation seminar in October. And if there are any questions, I'm here.
Wow. Thank you so much, Monona. That was amazing, amazing story that you have to tell and powerful information that you're providing there. Just really great. So we do have a few minutes for questions. And so let's go ahead and use the Q&A function on Zoom, if you would, and see what questions we might have for Monona. For the question about the Lautenberg law passed by Congress a few years ago. Monona, do you know what
Lautenberg. Oh, poor Lautenberg. They screwed him over so bad. That thing actually turns out to be a detriment. It started out really good. There were 200 chemicals originally, and they were going to be on a revolving list. As soon as one got all the testing, then another one would replace it. It got down to like about 10. And now we're looking at maybe 4 or 5 chemicals being tested in the next 5 years. I mean, it just got watered down again and again. And in the Trump administration, just to be perfectly frank, they took the last of the guts out of it. It's going to be a long time before that Chemical Safety Act is any use to us at all. Right now, it's actually just the opposite.
Is
that clear enough?
Thank you. Yes, that's very clear. We have a question. By venting these emissions, how do we understand the impact on the environment?
Well, hopefully there's sunshine and humidity that will kill the virus after it's been floating around. However, there is a math modeling study that shows that there's possible transmission downwind from cities from the total combined virus that's being released. That's a rather new study. I don't think it's peer reviewed yet, but you know, under medics, you can see all these studies before they're peer reviewed. And that one is a really interesting one. And there's also several studies showing building to building transmission of the virus. So yes, you have a good reason to consider where we're ejecting it.
Thank you. Let's see. Here's the question: how have you kept up your passion and purpose over the years after being pushed back down so many times?
I'm just mean. I just want to get even. It's just, you know, I'm gonna outlive all my enemies so that I can write about them and say whatever I want. And I'm going to just get my way sooner or later. I just keep pounding at the door until, you know, it opens or falls down.
Thank you. Let's see. Here's a question. What's your take under the Warren County PCB landfill? I'm not familiar with that. And the remediation, and would that land have future complications? Is that something you know?
No, I don't know about that.
Yeah, so, okay.
But I know quite a bit about PCBs, but
Okay, we got a question on a different front from Jennifer asking about your vocal warm-up process.
I have a keyboard in my apartment. You'll notice that you don't see anything in my background. I have a very small 3-room apartment, and my husband and I have both had COVID. He's going to be on oxygen for the foreseeable future. We had it in January, so this is a long-term thing. It has also left me with some disability in walking. I can get everywhere. I just kind of look like a duck when I do it. This apartment is now kind of cluttered with oxygen generators and concentrators and recliners and comfort things that, you know, it's not like other people's apartments at the time, for the time being. So yeah. Now, what was the question?
Your vocal warm-up process.
My vocal warm-up. So and the neighbors don't mind, but by the time I finish usually my work, it's 10 o'clock at night, and so from 10 to 11 is time. And since I couldn't perform for 2 years, what I did was, if you know vocal things, I replaced my voice. I changed the placement, and it's been a very interesting thing to do that at 85. But since they hear me on the street, I must be doing something right, and they're not complaining.
Any other questions anybody have for Monona before we move on? All right, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up this part of the keynote presentation. Thank you so much, Monona. Just really spectacular presentation, and you know, we've had you before. Hopefully, maybe we'll have you again sometime. Maybe in person. Hopefully, if we were live in person, I'd ask for a giant round of applause right now, and I'm sure you'd get one. But unfortunately, it's virtual.
And I would take a bow.
Well, great. So thank you so much, Monona. And we got a lot of sort of claps coming in over the chat. Not quite the same impact, but thank you so much.
Okie doke. I'm going to sit and watch because I want to hear Carolyn very much.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Carolyn Raffensperger. So Carolyn is Executive Director of the Science and Environmental Health Network. In 1982, she left her career as an archaeologist to move into the environmental movement. She first started working with the Sierra Club, addressing an array of environmental issues, and then began working for SEHN in December of 1994. She's an environmental lawyer specializing in the fundamental changes in law and policy necessary for the protection and restoration of public health and the environment. So I first became aware of the precautionary principle through work led by Carolyn. 1998, they released what was called the wing spread statement. That's where it really first came to wide attention around this country, I think, even though they'd been talking about it in Europe and elsewhere before that. And I heard about it then, was fascinated by it, and been fascinated by it ever since. And we actually had Carolyn, for those of you who've been around for a while at our conference, I looked in my archives, it was 2002 when we had her, when we were in Dallas. Some of you may have been around back then. And so Carolyn has written a couple of books about the precautionary principle, but the work of her organization goes beyond that. For example, Carolyn coined the term ecological medicine to encompass the broad notions that both health and healing are entwined with the natural world. She's also at the forefront of developing new models for government that depend on larger ideas of precaution and ecological integrity. Really fascinating stuff. I certainly encourage you to follow her organization, the Science and Environmental Health Network. They're putting out some great stuff, doing some great work there. So we're gonna turn it over to Carolyn now. You ready to go?
I am, and I've shared my screen. We'll see if it comes up. It says I'm sharing my screen. Is it showing up?
Looks good to me. I think we're good to go.
Okay, so you can see my slides.
Yes, we can.
Fabulous. So I want to thank Monona for being a woman who is a leader and a mentor. Some years ago, after the Wingspread conference, a woman my age said that women our age had not had women mentors because women had been kept out of leadership positions. And so a lot of us had to make our own way. And I think that you heard Monona's story of how women were not allowed to get PhDs, were not allowed to go on and get careers. They weren't believed when they spoke about public policy. And so for those women who've gone ahead of me, and I'm now old enough to have had my own experience with some of that sexism in the professional world, I just want to especially thank you, Monona, for your grit and determination. I also want to start with a bit of a story about how I came to the precautionary principle. All origin stories can start, there are many places that you can start something like that. And my father was a surgeon, is a retired surgeon. And my mom, by the way, is a professional musician. But my father was surgeon in chief of a children's hospital in Chicago, the Children's Memorial Hospital. And one day he came home and said that these birth defects and childhood tumors that he was the world's expert on actually had an environmental cause. And I said, well, Dad, why don't you do something about it? And he said, I can't prove it. And what I knew at that moment was that we were causing suffering that was actually preventable. So any of the statistics that you read about public health problems or birth defects, cancer, asthma, any of those problems, those are measures of suffering. And if we can prevent that kind of suffering, it is our obligation to do so. And so all those years when I was a child, knowing that we were actually causing preventable suffering was one of those Zen koans where I was trying to solve a problem that seemed obvious to me. So, I think about where we were with causing that kind of suffering and where decision-making was prior to 1998 or prior in the United States, prior in the 1980s, early 1990s, is this poem by Hafez. The small man builds cages for all he knows, but the wise woman must duck under the moon to throw keys to the beautiful and rowdy prisoners. And I think of Monona ducking under the moon to throw keys to the beautiful and rowdy prisoners. So I just want to tell you what I'm going to try and address today. So when we did the Wingspread Conference in 1998, it was a novel and useful tool that would not have emerged as a concept for government policy, but for the status of toxic chemical information and endocrine disruption in particular. It brought something unique to the table. It brought an ethic, a public health ethic, to bear at a time when the science of toxic chemicals was rapidly evolving and contested. So when we look back over the past 20 years, we have climate change, plastics, new technologies that are presenting pressing challenges and have in part eclipsed the problems of toxic chemicals, or at least brought them together. So what's the legacy of the precautionary principle? How is it used today? I'm going to talk a little bit about that past and then look at where we are today and the changing environmental and public health landscape. In the 1970s, there was this German idea of Vorsorgeprinzip, the forecaring principle. We don't even have a word in English for something similar. Forecaring comes as close as we can invent. And it was used in Germany in part to protect against some of the losses they were seeing in their forests. In 1978, we had Love Canal. And Lois Gibbs, an immensely important work, talking about chemicals, public health issues in her community in Love Canal. 1980, the Superfund law was passed. In 1988, Konrad von Moltke translated the word Vorsorgeprinzip into the precautionary principle at a meeting of Greenpeace in the United Kingdom in 1988. And it was the first conversation with US environmentalists and to some extent people in the UK about what this idea was about, what it was, what it could do. And just a parenthetical note about Konrad von Moltke, his parents were part of the German resistance during World War II. Father was a lawyer, and they convened an extraordinary group called the Kreisau Circle to imagine what government would be after Hitler. So they knew that Hitler would fall at some point, and they got together to think about governance in entirely new ways. I've written a little bit about the Kreisau Circle. His story and that history is amazing. And I think the precautionary principle is part of that entire legacy of resistance to Hitler, of imagining what government can and should do, what it can be, how we would form a democracy to meet the challenges of the day. In 1992, Principle 15 was written into the Rio Declaration, and central in some ways to this talk is in 1996, Theo Colborn and her colleagues published Our Stolen Future. And they started to document what endocrine disruption was all about. It was some new ideas in toxic chemicals. And also a little story. I was working for the Sierra Club in Chicago, and Theo Colborn came to do a briefing primarily for funders on endocrine disruption and some of the work that she had been doing on Great Lakes and birds. And I sat next to her because I was hosting this big event, and we were at the Palmer House and then one of those upper hotel rooms, and they gave us little tiny cherry tomatoes on our salad. And there were only two ways you can deal with that tomato that big. It was cut it in half or put the whole thing in your mouth. I put the whole thing in my mouth and bit down, and it squirted red tomato juice all over Theo Colborn's white pantsuit. She looked at me wryly, an older woman, and said, "I just had this pantsuit dry cleaned." We went on to do many other conversations together about the precautionary principle and endocrine disruption. But anytime I eat a cherry tomato, I think about Theo Colborn. The Rio Declaration says, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach should be widely applied by states according to their capabilities. Where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. So contrast that to the wingspread statement. The Rio Declaration is stated negatively. It shouldn't block precautionary action. The wingspread statement is stated affirmatively. So listen for the contrast. When an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, the precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. Conrad von Moltke was at that event at the Wingspread Conference. The Wingspread Conference was convened by me and a graduate student in 1998 at a wonderful conference center called Wingspread. And other really amazing things got created at Wingspread conferences. National Endowment for the Arts, NPR, all began at conferences at Wingspread. And the backstory to the conference was the same day that I got this proposal for a dissertation on this thing called the precautionary principle, I had been invited to apply to be president of the Johnson Foundation. Well, I knew that was a ruse because I knew all of the people before me had been men and they'd been ambassadors or things like that. So they were looking for a juvenile double X chromosome to fill the roster, but I knew that they would not actually hire me for that position. But I knew that if we held a conference like the ones that had created the National Endowment for the Arts, we might be able to put an idea on the map. And the graduate student had asked me to do a collaborative dissertation. And I knew it to be the answer to a question a wonderful activist had asked me. And that was, what's the alternative to risk assessment and cost benefit analysis in decision making? And the minute that I read that dissertation proposal, I knew that the precautionary principle offered us an entirely different way of approaching decision-making. So, we came up with a statement, the precautionary principle statement, which you can read elsewhere. And over time, we developed the mechanisms for putting it into place. How do you actually take precautionary action? So we came up with 5 steps, and I've written a lot about this, and I'm not going to belabor this, but you heed early warnings. Where are you getting information that there's trouble? There are lots of stories about early warnings. There have been some good reports, one called Late Lessons from Early Warnings. We set goals. What is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to prevent breast cancer? Are we trying to, what are we trying to do? So you set your goal. Then, you've got to set a roadmap to get to your goal. You identify and choose the best alternatives to harmful activities. So is bisphenol A a problem? Maybe you need to replace bisphenol, not just bisphenol A. So how do you identify and choose those best alternatives? You reverse the burden of proof. You actually have the polluter pay. You have the requirement that the proponent of an activity that may be harmful is obligated to test, is obligated to disclose information. And finally, you have to have democratic engagement. Over the years, I think that what you really need to do is consider that so much of what we're doing with environmental and public health policy is running experiments on the public. So if a university wanted to put a pipeline through a community as an experiment, they would have to go through an entire process to get free, prior, and informed consent. And we are running experiments on the public now with so many of our policies. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has identified free, prior, and informed consent as central to the rights of communities, of Indigenous communities. And it begins to assert a right with each other, that it's not always a right to something, but together. We hold some rights together. The right sits between us. And so the requirement for free, prior, and informed consent, it seems to me, is the best way to get the best guidance, democratic guidance on the precautionary principle. So, by the way, all of these have some hook in existing US law, heeding early warnings. We have a requirement to report adverse vaccine outcomes, setting goals. The Health and Human Services sets decadal goals for public health. Identifying and choosing the best alternative is in environmental impact statements. Reversing the burden of proof is in many situations. The Florida Constitution requires that the agricultural interests that pollute the Everglades actually pay. That's in the Florida Constitution. And then I mentioned democratic engagement. There's a number of places where you're required to get public input before making a decision. Free, prior, and informed consent is less of a matter of US law, except for where people are doing experiments. And I would argue that free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, is a good model for going forward with environmental law. So in my career at the Sierra Club, I was often told, you can't bring emotion into this picture. You leave your emotion at the door, and we're going to leave this all to the scientists. It doesn't matter what your experience is. It doesn't matter what if you feel like polluting children is a bad idea, too bad. You leave it at the door. And what Dr. Douglas Weed said, and he was at NIH at the time, said that the precautionary principle was the first decision rule he had heard of that coupled ethics with epistemology. What an extraordinary idea to bring together ethics with epistemology. This was a light bulb moment for us working on the precautionary principle. So I want to just talk a little bit about epistemology, what we know, what we don't know. I'm not going to belabor this. I've given day-long seminars with Dr. Ted Shetler on epistemology and the precautionary principle. But it brought the questions of scientific uncertainty into policy, to, false positives and false negatives. How does public policy address this? And is the question of which we prefer different in public policy? So let's just say this chemical, you get a type 1 error in finding out that this, and presume that this chemical is toxic when it is actually safe. That will drive more research. But if you get a toxic chemical that the tests say is safe, you stop further research. So I would submit to you that we would prefer type 1 errors, false positives in environmental policy to drive further research. I think it raised the question of conflicts of interest in a new way, not just bias, but real conflicts of interest. That so much of industry testing and then sitting on scientific bodies raised the question of whether the science was undertaken in a way that provided real answers. And then the evaluation of alternatives. But what we really discovered was that science alone isn't sufficient for decision making. It really does require ethics and then consent and democracy. Who should decide about high consequence issues characterized by scientific uncertainty? And the ethics, as I mentioned before, were really quite startling to us. Many people said, well, it was just, a nursery rhyme kind of idea. But the idea of preventing harm is deeply embedded in most ethical frameworks, Hippocratic Oath, the Golden Rule. And then, all of those little nursery rhymes, a stitch in time saves 9. A pound of prevention is worth, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Those tell us, the simplicity and the clarity of those tell us that these ethics are deeply ingrained in the survival mechanisms that our species has developed over time. But what was most surprising to us was that it introduced a time factor, that it was future oriented, that you're preventing harm in the future, that this was a brand new idea. And as climate change was emerging, this became a really important idea. So after wingspread, after 1998, public health practitioners recognized that the principle was really an essential tool and fit public health, the whole public health paradigm. And so in many ways, the precautionary principle was advanced by public health. There was widespread industry resistance. The chemical industry put together plans to even go through our garbage. I was called everything from a communist to a Nazi. I don't know how I was called both, but it was pretty ugly and pretty difficult. But activists adopted it and began advocating it for it in public policy. It was really led by breast cancer activists and by children's environmental health. And it was breast cancer activists, particularly in San Francisco, that led to its adoption in much of public policy. San Francisco adopted it to guide all environmental policy. Later, California EPA adopted it to guide environmental justice. There are many, many, many examples of it being adopted. And in some cases, using the language of forecaring. So there were some counties in California that adopted it and called for forecaring. The idea spread through the media. In 2001, after 9/11, the New York Times wanted to gather up all of the stories that they had neglected. And I had approached Michael Pollan at the time and asked him if he would like to write about the precautionary principle for the New York Times Magazine section, and he said he would. I met him in Minneapolis when he came to do a book reading for his book and spent the day with him. And we became friends. And he actually wrote about the principle in the New York Times Magazine section in the New and Innovative Ideas. It was really quite remarkable. Chemical and Engineering News, many unimpeachable news sources wrote about the precautionary principle in an open way. Now, what we see is that toxic chemicals are not the only issue on the table. Fossil fuels are the root problem of so many of the issues that we're facing. Plastics in the ocean, plastics, the number of plastic microparticles that are in baby feces. We have actually changed the chemistry of our bodies with plastics. Climate change is indisputably an existential crisis, and toxics are ongoing. So at the root of all of that, all those problems converging are fossil fuels. So the meta questions that I want to address is, what's the role of science and scientists, given that we are in a world that is so damaged and that we're facing huge uncertainty? What's the role of science and scientists? And then what is government for? So many of you work for government agencies, and I want to explore that a little bit with you today. Science now, as you well know from COVID and climate change, is that it's highly politicized. In part, I think that's due to the privatization of much scientific research through the Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act in the 1980s, that we do so much research paid for by the public and with universities and with corporations. And then we transfer the intellectual property rights to the private interests. And the theory behind that was that it would then get out to the public. But it's essentially privatized so much of our research. We have very high stakes at this point in most of our scientific research. And what we've done, especially with Bayh-Dole, is focused on developing technology to further the GDP, to further economics. And this is not a right or a left position. This is pretty much the view of what we want science and research to do. We want to win the race with China on new technologies. We want to increase our economic base. And so we have neglected some basic public health and environmental issues. In 1998, the same month that we convened the Wingspread Conference, Jane Lubchenco wrote a brilliant piece in Science magazine, AAAS, and called for a new contract, a new social contract for science. She said, we have done what we asked science to do. They've accomplished those goals. And now that we have these emerging problems on a human-dominated planet, we need to rethink that social contract with science. I would submit to you that we also need to dismantle the Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act and imagine a new way forward for science to publicly fund public interest research, things that will enhance public health, that will help us deal with climate, et cetera. And so the role of scientists in the 21st century, the duty to warn. I think you heard that from Monona with the 3D printers, that the duty to warn about what those printers might do to children, long-term damage if they're inhaling those particles. Now we need to distinguish in our science between the development of technology and understanding how the world works. Those have been conflated. And so when people doubt vaccines or nuclear power or genetically modified organisms, they're challenging technology. And there's a legitimate conversation to be had about developing new technologies and what their role might be, what dangers they might pose, whether they increase injustice, inequality. We have larger questions around the role of technology. And I think we've seen some of that played out badly around vaccines. We've got a long way to go to understanding that. But there's something different about knowing what happens when you add a lot of carbon dioxide to the environment. How the world works is different than the implications of a technology that is big, pervasive, takes funding from other areas, et cetera. So just one example, a new technology, it's not so new, but it's being promoted more widely, carbon capture and storage to retrofit oil refineries and other things with large carbon capture devices that take massive amounts more energy, and then capturing that carbon dioxide, compressing it, and shipping it through, burying it below the ground, or using it for enhanced oil recovery. And the debate is legitimate about whether we should be prolonging the life of those fossil fuels, whether we want to use public dollars for it, and enriching private corporations, et cetera. That's a really different question than what happens when that carbon dioxide hits the atmosphere. Scientists are the truth tellers, and we've watered that down in some ways with the privatization of science, with developing technologies and then scientists advocating for those particular technologies has muddied the waters. And I would submit to you, I've used that phrase a couple of times, it's an offering for you to consider what the role is of science as telling the truth. And then that future-oriented nature of the precautionary principle and using the power of science to predict outcomes. The international reports on climate change are laying out their predictions for what the world is going to look like if we don't take action. This is a critical role for scientists in the 21st century. And this dovetails with what government is for. In 1971, Lewis Powell wrote a memo asserting that the free market and the free enterprise was really the foundation of America and that business was under attack. He was writing in part in response to Ralph Nader's work on consumer safety. And the Chamber of Commerce picked this up. Lewis Powell later went on to become a Supreme Court justice. And that memo became the blueprint for the conservative agenda to reinforce the role of the free market and to dismantle government. So August was the 50th anniversary of the Powell memo. And what we've seen then are 50 years of orchestrated and well-funded attacks on the role of government. And it's resulted in several things. And for purposes of our conversation today, it's resulted in deregulation. So if you're going to both pay for development of new products and want to grow the GDP, you have a reduced incentive to regulate those same technologies. We have privatized many of the roles of government. So we sell our parking meters to private corporations. We've privatized many of the functions of government. And that means that we no longer have democratic control over this. In some cases, the long-term contracts with those private corporations really removes the power of government to plan and then, of course, to regulate. And it's resulted in austerity, that as we shrink government, we can't pay for many of the essential functions of government, for regulation, for enforcement, for dealing with so many of the big problems that we're facing. I approached the secretary, the treasurer of the state of Iowa about implementing a public bank so that we could fund some of the public interest issues. We have most of our money in Wells Fargo, and Wells Fargo was sanctioned for fraud. And they had been one of the major funders of the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I had been a lawyer on the Dakota Access Pipeline trying to stop that because of climate change. I was at Standing Rock trying to protect the Missouri River and the interests of indigenous people. And the state had so reduced the funding for the state treasurer's office that they didn't even have money to convene a commission to look at it. And so we keep our money in Wells Fargo because there's no other institution that has the software to actually move the money around in the state of Iowa. That is a tragedy. So in terms of the precautionary principle in government, when we started introducing the idea into governments, the regulatory agencies saw their role as balancing competing interests. And so when we raised the risk of cancer or neurological damage to a child, that was just one more competing interest. And it was balanced against the pesticide company's interest. Or if it was oil and gas, it was the oil and gas interest. It was the pipeline company's interest. It was the pipeline company's interest. And so children's brains were just one more. And they did not see their role as environmental or public health, even though that was in their charter. One agency in Michigan actually had a poster that said their job was to balance competing interests. And when I said, boy, that means, oh, and they said that meant they were successful if everyone was unhappy. And I said, well, I hope that your Valium a line item is going up, because making everybody unhappy is a recipe for misery for yourself. And I invited them to consider that they had a much more heroic role, which was to protect the earth, to protect children, to protect the environment, to be the hero, the guardian of public health and the environment. And the principle actually challenged the prevailing notion that government needed to get out of the way of business and let the market solve problems. It was clear that the market was not solving the problems and was causing more. And the issues raised by toxic chemicals was pretty clear evidence of that. So we're evolving the idea about the role of government. And I think the pandemic did a lot to raise those issues. So has racism. There's various governmental bodies that have identified racism as a public health crisis. And the country of New Zealand has said that their responsibility is well-being first and foremost. And so if that is true, how would we measure that? Would we only measure economic things? So the thing is that the child's neurological damage or that child's cancer actually increases the GDP because of all the needs for services, for pharmaceuticals, and so on. And it's pretty evident that economic measures leave out the key issues about well-being. And so we need to add some other things. Can we substitute public health indicators? Rene Dubos said that every civilization creates the conditions for its own diseases. And it appears that every civilization creates its own conditions for its own injustices. If we use public health measures, could we make better governmental decisions? Could we use evidence? Could we begin evidence-based decision-making? We don't even use really economic factors in state decisions. We just, it's all mumbo jumbo and platitudes, but we don't actually go back and see if our predictions were correct. So we need to measure public health and then use it in our decision making. And it's a time for a new industrial and materials policy, a new way of thinking about the research behind materials, how we regulate materials, what the government role is in driving an agenda that prioritizes public health and the environment. So the precautionary principle taught us a lot of things. it introduced the concept of time and the future. And with climate change, I think, has done for time what seeing that Earth, that beautiful planet, did from space. And we have a different concept of the future. So there's some things that I've done looking at the principles of perpetual care for. I worked on the giant mine in Yellowknife up in the Northwest Territories, and they have caused problems now that will last for 10,000 generations. My indigenous friends who said the precautionary principle is a 7th generation rule, we're no longer working within the bounds of 7 generations, 150 years, let's say. We are now causing problems that are into infinity, that are on geologic time, and we need to rein that back in. We have no right to inflict the kind of suffering that's preventable on future generations. We have no right. Scientific uncertainty brings ethics to that table. And we know now more about how to do that. We know how to prevent suffering. If there's nothing else that the precautionary principle teaches us, it's that we have a moral obligation to prevent the preventable suffering. It challenged the idea of what government is for. That if we think it's only by and for the economy, we're going to make corporations rich. We're going to turn a blind eye to their bad habits. We're going to let them externalize their costs into the commons. And we think that there's a different way to think about government and its responsibility. And it recognizes a changing role of science and scientists in the Anthropocene. Hard to say that word, isn't it? Especially when you mostly read it. And I want to just also honor the work that you all are doing. The policies of NAMA in looking at cradle to grave, it brings to bear some of the ideas of the precautionary principle to the table. Your policies on whether it's paint or other things is taking the steps, the responsible steps of what government should be doing. And I suspect that you've all looked at the cuts in funding, that you grappled with very, very difficult problems of environmental injustice, of the lack of ethics, of all the things that I've laid out, and that you are doing the work of the angels in trying to protect communities who have been disenfranchised in this generation and protecting future generations. The beginning is near. We have done a lot of damage, and it calls for new ideas. And I know that you all are doing such important work, and I want to honor you and thank you for doing that. Thank you so much.
All right. Really great. Thank you so much, Carolyn. Really inspiring, really powerful, really visionary stuff that you're doing there. We do have a few minutes for questions. So if folks have questions for Carolyn, let's go through the Q&A function on your Zoom interface here and let's see if we have some questions for Carolyn. Well, since we don't have any at the moment, I'm particularly intrigued by sort of what you're talking about, the convergence of the climate change and the plastics issue and the toxics issue. That's something that I've thought about for a while. And climate change is obviously a huge looming thing. I focused a lot of my career on the toxics side of things, but it's really interesting that these are kind of converging into a, interrelated set of issues. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit more.
Well, that was a new idea too to many of us. I work with Dr. Sandra Steingraber. If any of you know her work on fracking or know her book, Living Downstream, an ecologist looks at cancer. Sandra has come to work with us this summer and now is on our staff. And years ago, she said that what was at the reason for bringing these together, toxics, climate, plastics, all of these issues, was that at the root of these problems was fossil fuels. And so if we trace it back to the root, we've got a lot of work to do to shut down fossil fuels and find different ways to power our the essential functions of our world. And it involves everything from agriculture, transportation, all of the sectors. And so they're all connected, and they're all connected by this root of internal combustion engines and fossil fuels.
Thank you. Let's see, we got a question here. Did you say that overall the sicker person is better for higher GDP due to services and pharmaceuticals needed to support them?
I did. So if you look at how the GDP is calculated, all economic activity goes into that. And so a well person, who's not visiting the, many specialists, not using multiple pharmaceuticals, not using special services, the healthy person is a problem for the GDP. The pharmaceutical industry the healthcare industry is a huge part of our economic engine. And if we calculated well-being and invested in well-being, in preventing those diseases, we could flip that calculus.
Thank you. Let's see, here's a question. We're beginning to make initial progress on the deceptive use of the recycling symbol, the chasing arrows. Do you have any thoughts on how we approach the non-toxic deceptive labeling issue that Monona was talking about?
Oh, greenwashing is a problem. And everywhere you turn. And the difficulty is that we don't have good criteria for making decisions, and we haven't taught critical thinking. So the individual, the approach that we're all atomized individuals rather than an interconnected whole, and that we don't think systemically, I think has led to us thinking there's actually an away somewhere, that you can throw something away or you can recycle it. And that if you just put the recycling label on something, that actually means it's recyclable and going to be recycled. It is just an astonishing set of interlocking lies and greenwashing. But you all know that.
I think you're probably right, probably preaching to the choir somewhat on that one. We do have a question about the threat of plastic pollution in the ocean, and any your predictions on the effects of humans now and in the future on that plastic pollution?
Oh, I think we're just seeing the beginnings of the effects on humans. If you just look at one place like Louisiana, so the bio-based plastics, the bio-based fuels, and let's just say the connection between Iowa and Louisiana. So we use huge quantities of fertilizers and pesticides to grow corn, which then goes into bioplastics and biofuels, which by the way, we're going to sell to Oregon under your low-cost carbon standard. And good when they capture the CO2. But we were just moving CO2 around so that we'll meet your standard. We ship all of the fossil fuel, the pesticides and fertilizers down the Mississippi River, down to Louisiana. Their refineries and producing oil that's combined with the ethanol. And the plastics that are made, the big plastics plants that are made out of all of that oil and biofuels, now polluting the ocean, whether they're because of their being shipped, being spilled, whether it's a plastic bag, it's all connected. Oregon's carbon fuel standard is connected to the dead zone in the Gulf. And when we're killing the Gulf, the dead zone in the Gulf is a result of the fertilizers and pesticides used in Iowa to produce this. There's very little life. Then when you're filling it with the nurdles, the little microplastics, that is what the fish have to eat. We're killing the corals. It is all interconnected. And we don't think about what happens when Oregon sets a standard like that for Iowa's ethanol and what it happens to Louisiana and the ocean. It's all connected.
Really great. Thank you, Carolyn. And we do have to bring the session to a close here. I would again direct everybody to the Science and Environmental Health Network website to see some of the great visionary work that you guys are doing. I'm finding myself really bummed out that we're not live in person and can't, chit chat with you and Monona over lunch or over our social hour. That's one thing I really miss about our in-person conferences. Hopefully we can do that down the line in the future. If we were live, we would have another great round of applause for both of you right now. So really, thank you so much to both of you. And we are going to bring this session to a close here. One quick piece of NAMA business for those of you who are NAMA members, and our election is closing today. Please go to your email and go to the board member information and select our new board members for all your NAMA folks. And yeah, we're going to go ahead and bring the session to a close. So thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.